Welcome back, classmates. Welcome back, class. Mr. Rasmussen here. This is lesson 8C. In this lesson, we're just going to talk really briefly about the cell cycle. So this lesson is going to be all on the cell cycle. I put up kind of a cool picture I found. And here is a picture of a cell dividing, and you can kind of see all the parts down here. They used fluorescence to make different parts glow different colors. For instance, the chromosomes here, they made glow blue. Some of the cytoskeleton parts they made glow red and green. So if they look at them under a certain type of light, they'll glow. And so when they put everything together here, here's what we see. So this is kind of a cool picture of a cell dividing, and it's in what we call telophase. Telophase. So it's finishing up its cell division. I put these pictures up here because I wanted to talk a little bit about the cell cycle, but cell division is a part of the cell cycle, but it's not a very big part. It's a really small part of that life cycle of the cell, a really small part of what these cells do, and I want us to get the big picture of what their life cycle actually looks like. A couple terms I want you to keep in mind. This idea of interphase versus mitosis. Two terms you're going to see a lot. This term interphase basically means everything other than mitosis. So if we look down here, here's our cell cycle. We have G1, S, G2, and we'll talk about all those. And then we come down here and we have M, and this M stands for mitosis. So M equals mitosis. So M stands for mitosis, and C stands for something called cytokinesis. These two phases are what we call mitosis, and the rest of it, G1, S, and G2, are all part of interphase. So interphase is the rest of the cell cycle other than mitosis. So when a cell is not dividing, it is in interphase, and there's a lot of different small stages, but that's what it spends the majority of its time in. If we look at our cell cycle here, here's the cell cycle. This orange diagram out here, we have M, which again stands for mitosis. So this little chunk is mitosis. And this outer diagram is just showing you that everything else is all interphase down here. So all this is interphase. The only part that's not interphase is this little M, which stands for mitosis. Okay, so everything other than mitosis is interphase. Now, mitosis we break down, or I'm sorry, not mitosis. Mitosis we'll break down in the next lesson. But the cell cycle, or interphase here, we break down into three parts. G1 phase, so the first phase after mitosis. So after a cell is done dividing, it goes into G1, or what's called gap. Gap 1 phase. Not a very good one, but we'll take it. So gap 1 phase, and in gap 1 phase, the cell is going to grow. It's going to do its normal life cycle things. It's also going to start replicating organelles, things inside the cell that the cell needs to survive. It's going to replicate and divide organelles. It's going to make proteins. It's going to exist and live. So that's gap 1. Then what happens is something signals the cell to move into the S phase. Over here, the S phase. S stands for synthesis. So S equals synthesis. So S stands for synthesis, and in synthesis, a cell is copying its DNA. So it grew in gap 1, it copied its organelles, and then it hits S phase, and it copies its DNA. It copies its genetic information, and after it's done copying its genetic information, it moves into gap 2 phase. Gap 2 phase. And in gap 2 phase, the cell grows. The cell's going to actually physically get bigger. It's going to grow a little bit, and it does that in order to have normal sized cells when it splits, because what comes next is mitosis. It's also going to finish up dividing anything else it needs to divide in order to prepare for mitosis. So in gap 2, it's preparing for mitosis. It hits mitosis, it divides, and then it goes back into interphase into gap 1. Now, one thing that's in here that we didn't talk about is this gap zero. And sometimes cells can be pulled out of the normal life cycle. They can be pulled out into gap zero or a resting phase. A phase that just means the cell's at rest for a long time, and it'll come out and it'll just sit there. A good example would be your brain cells. Your brain cells, after a certain age, they stop dividing. Those cells are all in gap zero or G0. They're all in that resting phase, so they're not going to divide anymore. Some cells can come out of gap zero and go back into G1. Some cells don't. Some cells, once they're out of this normal cell cycle and into G0, they never go back. So that's the cell cycle. Now, one last thing I wanted to touch on is just this idea of checkpoints. There are things called checkpoints that work as like stoplights. So, for instance, one of them here is the checkpoint between G1 and S, this little checkpoint here. And what this means is a cell is going to stay in G1 until it reaches a signal, until it gets a signal to move into the S phase. So without that signal, it'll never move out of G1. It won't divide until a cell gets a signal. And then it moves into the S phase, and it'll stay in the S phase until it gets another signal, until something signals that it's done replicating, and then it'll move on into G2. And then at the end of G2 here, excuse me, at the end of G2 there's another checkpoint, so right here. And it'll stay in G2 until it gets that one last signal that allows it to move into mitosis. So these checkpoints work as stop signs. The cell is not going to move on until it gets a signal. It's going to stay in that part of the cell cycle until it's ready to move on. So very important for cells, important for things that we'll talk about later like cancer and other diseases. So important for cancer because some of these checkpoints don't exist in cancer and the cell can just divide at will, or it continually divides, and then we get uncontrolled cell growth, which is cancer. So these checkpoints are very important to our normal functioning of our body. So that's lesson 8C. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me in class.